Thank you for those who've muted themselves as they've come on. Welcome to Atlas of Life's last event in Science Week, which is, thank you very much to Thomas for sharing his expertise in iNaturalist. And I think everyone's very much looking forward to learning more skills from Thomas around iNaturalist. The idea for the event was born out of the heavy usage that iNaturalist now receives in the Bega Valley, and given the amount of interest we've had in the session, it's proven to be a good thing to do. Right, I won't dilly-dally. I'll hand over to Thomas, who'll run the session. We'll be using chat throughout, and yeah, if you could mute yourself as you come on board, it will be helpful. So over to you, Thomas.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Raymond. So for anyone who's ever been to one of my previous workshops, pretty much the way I'll run it is I will just actively use iNat, and I'll share my screen in a second, and just run through a whole lot of what I think, at least, and hopefully everyone else thinks as well, are fairly useful tips and tricks and different pieces of functionality that, given today is meant to be an advanced workshop, a lot of things that I perceive to be as a bit under the hood and may not necessarily be immediately obvious to a lot of people. So hopefully I end up teaching you at least one or two new tricks that you didn't know about before. And as Raymond said, absolutely, if you've got any questions at any time, please feel free to type them into the chat at any time whatsoever. Don't worry about saving them to the end. I'll keep an eye on the chat throughout. And so if you do have a question, pop it in and I'll answer it as we go along. And just as the last point before I start, so I do have a list that Raymond gave me of a few kind of questions and discussion points that a few people, presumably some of you that are in the call, did want to cover. So I will address those first, and then I'll dive into some of the kind of topics and tips that I have come up with myself. So I'll share my screen now. And we'll go here. So the first thing that did get asked by someone that is hopefully in the call right now, and hopefully their question is getting answered, is about the relationship between iNaturalist and the ALA. So as a very, very brief overview and summary, iNaturalist has many regional nodes. So these are where countries like Australia, places like New Zealand, Costa Rica, Argentina, I think at this point it's around 30 or so places around the world. They develop these regional nodes. Now, in terms of functionality, there's not really any difference, but they basically serve as a bit of an administrative hub per se, and just a way of attaching some kind of respected body or organization within that country to iNaturalist in that region. So in Australia's case, it's the ALA that has partnered up with Australia as the local node. As I said, functionality-wise, there is effectively no real difference if you log into the global iNaturalist portal, which is just www.inaturalist.org, or if you specifically want to log into the Australian portal, you'll notice that the URL is slightly different. It becomes inaturalist.ala.org.au. And literally the only difference from your user perspective is that if you log into the Australia specific portal, all observations when you're browsing them will be automatically filtered to Australia only. So you won't see any observations from anywhere else in the world. And even with that filter on, you can easily turn it off with a single button when you are in the Australia view. So I know that some people have asked me previously, is there a difference if I log into iNaturalist broadly or iNaturalist Australia specifically? Effectively zero difference whatsoever from a user perspective. Now, one of the big benefits as well is that iNaturalist records get exported into the Atlas of Living Australia. So anytime you upload a record, at some point, and usually it's about a week that it will take, but it can be a bit faster or a bit slower, it will then appear in the Atlas of Living Australia. Now, another thing that people always ask me about is which kind of records go in. All research grade records, but also all needs ID records. So it's not only research grade things that go into the ALA, it is also needs ID records. The only two types of thing that are excluded from the ALA is one, casual records. So things that are planted or non-wild animals, things that are missing location or date or photos or some other kind of important piece of metadata. Casual records won't go in. And also records that have a restrictive copyright license. So if you've set your records and photos to be all rights reserved, for example, your records will not go into the ALA. And just as a very brief tangent there, I can show you how you can check what you've got your licensing at the moment. So when you first signed up for an iNaturalist account, the default is a more relaxed license that does allow your records to go into the ALA. But just in case you've accidentally changed it or something like that, you can check it by editing your profile settings. You go to content and display, and then you scroll down to this licensing menu, and you'll see there's a license attributed to your observations. There's a license attributed to your photos themselves, and then also to any sound recordings you might have uploaded. And you'll see at the moment, my license is set to CC BY. So that's not the default. That's a even less restrictive one that I've set my licenses to be. And it will tell you here what they're getting used for from a broad perspective. So you can see that it's only these top 3 licenses that allow your records to be exported to GBIF. For anyone unfamiliar with GBIF, GBIF is basically just the global version of the Atlas of Living Australia. And you'll see it's actually only these 2 licenses, and then this one down here, that allow your records, more specifically your photographs, to actually be used in Wikimedia. So this means that potentially, if you use one of these licenses, your photos could get used in Wikipedia articles. So if that's something you're interested in, that's a change you can make. This one here that I'm highlighting, CC BY NC, that is the default license when you create an iNaturalist account. So if you've never touched this setting, then 99% likely this is the license that will currently be getting applied to your records. If that is the case, your records will be going into the ALA. That's fine. But if you have explicitly changed one of your licenses to one of these more restrictive ones, your records will no longer be going into the ALA. So it's worth checking just in case something weird happened. And then in terms of actually finding your records in the ALA, it's really easy. So there'll actually be a little badge on each of your records that tells you whether it's in the ALA or not. So if I search for one of my old records, and let's pick this one. So here's an impressively large centipede that I found out in the Western Australian desert last year. If I scroll down, you'll see that there are actually 2 little badges here that explicitly tell you which external platforms that your records are featured on. And if I click the Atlas of Living Australia here, it will actually take me to the record in the ALA. So this shows me the exact record in the ALA that has been ported over from iNaturalist. So really simple, easy way to see whether your records are being ingested by the ALA or not. And you can do it in the other direction as well. So if I start on the ALA, I can look at all my records that are currently in iNaturalist. And to do this, you would go to search and analyze. You would go to search species. Actually, it's search download records. And then if you go to advanced search, what you want to do is put your name in as the collector name. Click search. And as well, please tell me at any point, anyone, if I'm going too fast or if you want me to repeat something. And then you can see all my records that are in the ALA. And then if we scroll down here and you go to data resource, you can tick iNaturalist Australia. And so this is now showing the 45,000 odd records that I've uploaded to iNaturalist that have now gone into the ALA. And Susan just added a comment saying, exciting development for her anyway, since she lives on Norfolk Island, that yesterday at long last, the external territories of Australia are now being included with the ALA observations. Yeah, absolutely. I was extremely excited about this as well. And just to clarify for people who were unaware about this issue, on iNaturalist, if you search for Australia, it doesn't actually include some of the external islands and territories. So if I search for the place Australia, and you'll see all the places that are included in Australia outlined in orange, you'll see that yes, Lord Howe Island is included. Yes, Macquarie Island is included. But if we look at Norfolk Island, you'll see it's not actually included within the place Australia on iNaturalist. And if you want to find Norfolk Island records, you have to actually manually search for Norfolk Island separately. So if we do that, you can see the Norfolk Island records. This isn't the only case. There are a number of other ones as well. So for example, Christmas Island, Cocos Islands, a few other remote islands. I actually wrote a journal post about this a few months ago. So it's just got to quickly find it. So I'll pop this link in the chat for anyone who's interested, because it tells you exactly which places. I've got to find it. It tells you which places do not get included in Australia. Oh, where is it? I've written too many journal posts to go through. Where is this one? It's not July. April, bear with me. I apologize. So this will just be a useful thing for you so you can see exactly. Yeah, okay, I'll have to find that later. But basically, I've written up a journal post where I've got the exact list of the places. Maybe if I search for it. Yeah. Let me just bear with me for 1 second. I might just scroll down all the way if I just search for Norfolk. Here we go. Don't know how I didn't find that. So I'm going to post this link into the chat for you. So can you just let me know if you can see that? So has everyone just seen the link that I posted into the chat?
Yep.
Yep, sweet. So pretty much that tells you that there's 4 places, or 4 islands that are not included within the place Australia. So you need to search for them separately. So that's Norfolk, Christmas, Cocos, and then Heard and McDonald Islands. And then there's also actually a 5th place, which is the Australia Exclusive Economic Zone. And that's the international waters around Australia. So this includes a lot of super tiny and remote Great Barrier Reef islands, for example, or if you've been on a pelagic and gone out and seen seabirds, those records won't be included within Australia. They're in this exclusive economic zone. And yeah, as Susan just indicated, these records never actually came across from iNaturalist into the ALA, but just as of a week or 2 ago, they are being included now. So that's a really, really nice feature. Okay, so another question I had was in terms of obscuration. So someone asked about how obscuration works with the ALA. And so I'll give a demonstration of that with the giant cuttlefish. And just as a prelude to that, I'll also just briefly, so I find that even experienced users still often aren't entirely sure about how obscuration on iNaturalist works. So effectively, when you obscure a record on iNaturalist, this can occur in one of 2 ways. You've got taxon geoprivacy, which is where records get automatically obscured by the system. So this is based on predominantly threatened species. So you can see in this case for the giant cuttlefish, it's currently listed as near threatened by the IUCN. So if we go to the status tab, you can see it's near threatened and the taxon geoprivacy is listed as obscured. So what this means is that automatically when someone uploads a record of sepia or palmer at any time, it will automatically be obscured. They have no choice. Then the other way to obscure things is at an individual level. So for example, I might find an orchid while I'm out walking and I upload photos of it, and it's not necessarily officially listed as endangered, but maybe I'm worried that someone else will see my photos on iNaturalist and then come back the next day and poach the orchid. So I can manually obscure it at an individual basis as well. Now, regardless of what type of obscuration it is, what happens is that the system takes the true coordinates that you entered, and then it randomly scrambles them into what is roughly a 500 square kilometer box. The actual dimensions are 0.2 degrees of latitude by 0.2 degrees of longitude. And so depending on where you are on the globe, this box will be a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger. But effectively, this is what it looks like on the map within iNaturalist. You'll see this big orange box with a big orange point in the middle. That big circle is the randomly generated location. And the true location, which you are unable to see, is somewhere inside this box. Now, these records do go into the Atlas of Living Australia, which is what someone asked about. However, they are excluded by default. So if I search for Sepia rupama, I can show you what this looks like. So you can see I'm now looking at all Sepia rupama records in the Atlas of Living Australia. And you can see here it says 1,309 records returned of 2,881. So almost all of those missing records are the ones coming from iNaturalist. So you can see here this map at the moment. This is only showing stuff that is not coming from iNaturalist. Because at the moment, iNaturalist records are being excluded under this particular data filter. So you can see here in this filter, it says records are being excluded based on location uncertainty. If we are to click on those, you can see exactly what's being excluded. And if we scroll down on the left, you can see almost 100% of those are the ones coming in from iNaturalist. So that's the consequence of things being obscured on iNaturalist, is that they will go into the Atlas of Living Australia, but they will be excluded from all maps by default. And if I want to include them, all I've got to do is just untick that box, and you'll see that they do get included. There are multiple ways of accessing the true coordinates. One is that you can contact the Atlas of Living Australia directly. So if you are a researcher or a conservationist or a land manager and you genuinely need the true coordinates of some threatened species that you're working with, for example, you can contact the Atlas of Living Australia and they will give you the true coordinates, provided, of course, you are legitimate and your use case is legitimate. You can do the same thing by directly contacting iNaturalist, although if you're doing it on kind of a single species or few species basis, they're probably less likely to say yes, just because it's a bit of a waste of their time, for want of a better phrase. Unless you were wanting data at a massive scale, then I would recommend just going through the ALA directly rather than going through iNaturalist. You can also trust individual users. So if I go to my profile, you have to be following them first. That's the one thing. So once you follow someone, you can go to your edit account settings, you go to relationships, and you can actually choose to trust people with your hidden coordinates. So you can see there's an option, a tick box there. So if you do that, then it means whenever that person is viewing your records, they'll be able to see the true location. And then the final way to see the true locations of things is to set up a particular project. And then there will be an option for when people join your project, they can say, yes, I trust the curators of this project with my hidden coordinates. So those are all multiple ways of getting around obscuration. But generally, yeah, they require permission from some kind of party. And so it's generally a fairly robust measure to make sure that those locations are kept obscured. But I guess, yeah, short version of that answer is that if you obscure things, they're definitely still useful, and they definitely still go in the ALA. It's just that the locations will be denatured, which occurs with professional and vouchered records as well. So many Western Australian plants that are collected and deposited at herbaria, the exact same process will apply. Those locations will be denatured within the ALA, and by default, they'll be excluded from the basic maps. So someone asked, can you apply obscuration on the iPhone app? Yeah, absolutely, you can. Please correct me if I've misinterpreted your question there. But yes, you can apply obscuration whether you're in the iPhone app, the Android app, or the desktop. Should be a little box that you can tick. Okay, so, and someone asked, do iNat records go into Bionet? Simple answer is no. So iNaturalist records will go into the ALA. Bionet records also go into the ALA, but iNaturalist records do not go into Bionet. Someone asked about seed banking. So obviously, if people are out there part of seed bank organizations and are wanting to collect seeds and material, how can iNaturalist help them? Well, a really good way of doing this is through, so just to clarify, so they said, no, they don't want to see obscured records on the map. So on the iPhone app, no, there's really no way to exclude obscured records from the map. That's largely because iNaturalist, the iPhone app is very, very basic in terms of its functionality. So this is something I say in a lot of my workshops. If you want all the cool functionality and the complex functionality, you need to use the desktop. Then the Android app has some of it, but the iPhone app has kind of extremely basic functionality and is missing many, many features that are present on the desktop. So the answer to that is no. If you want to exclude obscured records from turning up on the map, you're not interested in seeing them, you can't do that on the iPhone app. So for those seed bank individuals, you can take advantage of the fruiting annotation. So you'll notice that if I go to one of my records, one of my plant records, so this occurs for any plant record, you can see that there is the ability to add annotations under plant phenology on the side here. And you can see that there are always going to be 4 different options, which is flowering, flower budding, fruiting, or no evidence of flowering. So for here in this case, you can see I've got flowers, so I can add flowering annotation. But where this comes in really handy for these seed bank applications is that you can explicitly search for records that only have been annotated as fruiting for a particular species. So let's pick Acacia longifolia, for example. So let's say you wanted to collect some seeds for Acacia longifolia. So what you'd do first is you would just search for Acacia longifolia. Now, let's say I was only interested in New South Wales records. So we'll add that place filter as well. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go directly in and manually edit the URL. So this is something I've covered kind of briefly in a lot of my previous workshops, but just as a very, very quick lowdown in case people haven't been to any of those ones before. When you are doing searches, there is a filters box here, which allows you to apply a whole lot of really nice filters to narrow down your search. However, this is just the tip of the iceberg, and there is a huge, huge amount of additional filters that you can apply if you click into the URL and manually and directly edit it yourself, rather than clicking one of these pre-filters or pre-selected filters. So if I just click in the URL now and see what's happening with my current search, you'll see that there's these 2 extra strings of text that have been added. So the first one is this. place_ID equals 6825. Now that is the unique code for New South Wales. So within iNaturalist, every single place has a unique identifying code. And when you search for that place, that code will appear in the URL. The exact same thing applies at all taxonomic ranks. So you can see here the extra text taxon_ID equals 63379. That's the unique identifying code for Acacia longifolia. And every single taxon at every taxonomic rank will have a unique identifying number as well. So here, what I need to do to only get fruiting individuals of Acacia longifolia is to add an extra bit of text myself. And in this case, it will look like this. Ampersand, so whenever you want to apply a new string of text, you got to use the and symbol. Ampersand term_ID equals 12. So that is the code for saying I want to search in the plant phenology annotation. Then you add another ampersand, and now we'll go term_value_ID equals 14, because 14 is the code for fruiting. We'll press enter. Now we're only looking at observations of Acacia longifolia where someone has annotated them as fruiting. So now this provides you a perfect opportunity to browse through some of these records and see both when these records were uploaded and where they were uploaded. which then gives you a good sense of how to target particular populations if you are interested in seed collection. So we can open up this particular one. Now they're not really visible in the photos, but this person has obviously annotated it as fruiting. In this particular case, I suspect this is probably a mistake. And this one seems like it's only flowering. So I'm going to add my flowering annotation. So that's the other thing. You can add annotations to other people's. So I'm going to downvote the fruiting annotation here and just leave a comment for them. So if we go back to our examples, so let's just open this one, for example, you can see that Acacia longifolia in this case was fruiting and lots of juicy seeds available there on November 26 at this particular location. So this is a really great way of finding individual records that may have been uploaded recently that are fruiting. Alternatively, another way of doing this is to go directly to the profile. So if I go to the profile of Acacia longifolia, you'll see there are these handy graphs, and these graphs are generated automatically from those annotations. So here, the relevant graph for you would be the plant phenology one. So I can click that. And here you can see that fruiting is in blue. So all I've got to do is hover over these lines and it tells you when these plants have been recorded as fruiting. So you can see here, Acacia longifolia, there are 31 records of them fruiting in September, 47 in October, 33 in November, goes down to 18 December, and then January 8, February 3, all single digit numbers. So you can see here, you can immediately see that it seems to be, at least from annotated records, the peak in the fruiting period for Acacia longifolia is from September to November. So if you were interested in collecting seed for Acacia longifolia, you would probably go out at some point in that time. And that makes sense, right? Because you can see where the peak for flowering is, and it's kind of delayed by a few months beforehand. So Acacia longifolia tends to flower from about June to September. And so then accordingly, it tends to fruit from September to November. So Paula asked a question and said, where do we find all the codes and values that we can add? Good question. You can do this in a particular forum thread. So for anyone that is unfamiliar with it, iNaturalist has a discussion forum. I highly recommend joining it. It's a fantastic way where if you've got questions at any time, you can ask them and you get a pretty quick response. I'm a moderator on the forum, and what we can do is there's an entire thread here, which I'll now post into the chat, where it gives you a complete breakdown of every single way that you can possibly manually edit that URL. So it's a really, really fantastic tool.
Sorry, I better mute myself.
No worries. So here you can scroll down and you can see this comprehensive list of all the different ways to edit the URL. So here's the annotations one. So if we click that, you'll see this is a comprehensive breakdown of all of the different codes that are required for annotations. So you can see here exactly what I typed in. Remember, I typed in and term ID equals 12 because that's plant phenology. And then I typed in and term value ID. And then I typed in 14 because that's fruiting. So really handy and simple thing. So Erin then just said, is it possible to further filter the search for fruiting plants to a geographic area or project? Yes, absolutely. So if I go back to my page, let's say you're only interested in Greater Sydney. All I've got to do is just type into the location filter and type in Greater Sydney. So now I've restricted it to Sydney. And if I then even only wanted to restrict it, so let's say I remove that place. Let's say I wanted to restrict it to a particular project. I would open up the filters. I would go to projects here. Let's go Atlas of Life in the Coastal Wilderness. You can see there are 4 records of Acacia longifolia that are fruiting in that particular project. So really, really straightforward to apply as many of these filters as you would like. Now, another question that I had from people revolved around weeds and how we can map weeds and invasive plants better on iNaturalist, and how we can encourage people as well to log these weed records more. So really, really, really good questions. Weeds and other kinds of kind of invasive and introduced plants are something I like to focus on a lot myself. And that's a big part of my observations and the IDs I make. I want to make just a few points here. So one is that you can easily search for all introduced species in a particular area. And I'll show you how to do this. So if we just search for vascular plants up here. So now I'm searching for all vascular plants. Let's restrict it to Atlas of Life in the Coastal Wilderness again. So at the moment, I'm now looking at all plant observations that have been uploaded to this particular project. But let's say I'm only interested in seeing the introduced ones. I'll go to filters, and then there's a nice handy box here, which says introduced. I'll tick that box. Now I'm only looking at all effectively the weeds, right? All the stuff that's been marked as introduced. And you can go to the species tab and you can see all of them will have this little pink square with IN in it, indicating it's introduced. And so you can see these are all weed species. The important thing here, though, is that introduced tag does not get added automatically by iNaturalist. It's something that has to be added manually. And it's what I spend a huge amount of my time on iNaturalist doing, is manually annotating new weed records as introduced where relevant. So I can very quickly show you how I actually do this. So for example, you've got onion grass here, which would be a weed that many of you will be very familiar with. It's a pretty common weed in Australia. You often see it popping up in lawns. It should be appearing right about now, pretty much. So you can see here on this seasonality graph, this is for the world. This big peak corresponds to spring in the Northern Hemisphere. And then this big peak corresponds to our spring when it starts to appear. So pretty much you can see August, September is where this species starts to appear, at least flowering, which is when it's most noticeable. So you can see here, it's already says it's been listed as introduced in Australia. But if we go to, now let me see, one of the, okie dokie. So if we go to that particular variety, yep, that's the one I wanted. Okay, so if we go to this particular variety, however, which is also a weed in Australia, you'll see that it hasn't actually been marked as introduced to Australia yet. So I'll show you how I do that. And just to completely double check, we can see, confirm, you can see, yes, this particular variety is listed as a weed. So if we go back to our thing, so I'll show you how to do this. So every place, or at least most places in iNaturalist, have what's called a checklist. Now, this is a fairly old feature, and it's a bit of a buggy feature. And in fact, iNaturalist doesn't actually update any bugs or problems associated with this feature anymore, but I still find it super useful and use it all the time. Records that become research grade will automatically filter into this as a very brief explanation of how it works. So for this Australia checklist, any species that it currently has at least one research grade observation for Australia will just automatically go into it. But things that are currently only needs ID need to be manually added by like a curator like myself. So what I'll do here is I will search for this particular species, and I'll just set the rank to any. So I'll search for it. I've set the rank to any, so it includes infra-specific taxa. You can see this pops up. I'll go to edit. And here you can see there's a little field that says establishment means. I click edit. I change that to introduced. I'll then click save. So now if I go to any one of these records in Australia, you'll see it now has the pink exclamation mark, which indicates that it's introduced. So this is what as I said, I spend a lot of my time doing, is looking for new weeds that people have been recording on iNaturalist that have never been uploaded for Australia before. I'll then double check first whether the ID is correct. Then I'll check whether it's actually growing wild as opposed to, say, growing planted in a garden. And then I'll double check whether it's actually an introduced species, because sometimes you might get species that are, say, native to Queensland, but non-native to New South Wales. So I have to deal with those a little bit differently. And then if it all ticks all the boxes, I'll annotate it as introduced. And so then once I've done that, it will then turn up in all of your searches. So that's the first thing I want to point out, is that if you do see a species on iNaturalist that you know is definitely a weed in your area, but it hasn't been marked as such, so it doesn't have that pink exclamation mark when you look at an observation of it, feel free to tag me in the observation or send me a message, and I will annotate it as introduced for you. The other point here is that there's a really effective way that I find of helping council or your local weed organizations of keeping track of weeds in your area. And that is to create a collection project with the weeds set as a filter. So a really nice example of that is this particular project. So this is a project that was set up by a guy, James Bevan. He is a weed officer, I believe. Yeah, so he's the bush care officer and natural areas officer working for Blue Mountain City Council. And he's working with the Creek Catchment Community Working Group. And what they've done is they've come up with a list of priority weeds in their particular area. And so then what they did was he created a collection project. He then, as the spatial filter, if I scroll all the way down, you see for the location, he's set the place, and you can see that outlined in yellow as his particular spatial filter. And then you can see as the species filters, he has included all of the priority weeds for their particular area. And so then what happens now is if any particular user observes one of these weed species somewhere in that defined area, it will automatically go into this project. And so this becomes a really, really useful monitoring tool for weed officers, land care officers, council officers to monitor weeds that are being recorded in your particular area. And the reason it's so fantastic is that as these inclusion filters, you can specify species that haven't even been seen in your area yet. So you can set up effectively an early monitoring tool, early detection tool, where you say, well, X, Y, and Z species are really, really nasty weeds. They've been seen in some surrounding LGAs, but they haven't been seen in our particular area yet. So I'll set them up as a filter. And then as soon as someone potentially sees one in our area, it will automatically go into this project. And so then if they're regularly looking at that project, they will immediately see when someone has observed one of those priority weeds in their area. So it's a fantastic kind of biosecurity tool that people can use. So Martin just asked me to share the Australia checklist. So I will get that link for you. So I have popped that in the chat. So that's the link to the Australia checklist. So yeah, so this is what I would recommend. So if you are some kind of bush care officer or you're involved with bush regen or land care or weeds in some way at any governmental level, this is a really, really great tool that you can build. And I'm happy to chat more in detail with people afterwards if this is something you would like to do. And I guess just finally as well, so someone asked beforehand if they want to know about how can we encourage the public to record more weeds on iNaturalist. I think it's a fantastic question. It's a tricky one. I think one of the ways that you can try and encourage people to record more weeds is just letting them know how valuable the records actually are, and that nowadays there are increasingly more species that are becoming naturalized and are kind of hovering on that border of becoming a weed or not from things like gardens. So of course, nowadays, it's very, very easy to buy seeds and plants pretty much from anywhere in the world and have them mailed to you. And so you can plant all kinds of exotic species. And unfortunately, many of these have high potential to become weedy, whether it's because they produce huge amounts of seeds that are easily dispersed by the wind, or they've got really attractive fruits that are dispersed by birds. There are a huge number of species every year that are starting to become naturalized that start off as garden plants or ornamentals. And so iNaturalist users are kind of on the front line of detecting these new naturalizations. And so I think that's one way to sell it, is that you are actually genuinely playing a very impactful and important role, and that you really can contribute to the field. So as kind of one random example, liquid amber. So this is a species that many of you would be familiar as a street planting, pretty commonly planted throughout Australia, very commonly planted in Sydney as a street tree, particularly in the city. And it's very much not native to Australia. If I go to PlantNet, which many of you would be familiar with, basically gives you a breakdown of all plant taxa recognized for New South Wales. it's not even recognized as naturalized. And in fact, if I even go to the APC, so the Australian authority, and I type in liquid amber, it's not recognized as naturalized for Australia either. But there is a national park in Sydney that I often go to, Garigal National Park, and there is a big liquid amber tree growing along the creek, where obviously at some point a bird has dropped in seeds, and it's pretty healthy. At this point, it's like 4 or 5 meters tall. So I recorded it, uploaded it to iNaturalist. That record is still on there. I should say is now up there. I've also collected physical specimens of this plant, and I've lodged it at the herbarium. And so this is a really fantastic way of recording weed species that aren't necessarily currently being recognized by the state or the country as naturalized. So Bob and Joy asked, can you get a list of your observations that have not been identified yet? And do people check older entries? So absolutely yes to both of those questions. So in order to check your records, your own records that are still needs ID, what you would do is go to your observations up the top here. And then it's just a simple matter of going to filters and then clicking needs ID here. So this will show all of your records that still require some kind of confirmation. Now, this is not a perfect way of showing things that haven't been identified by other people, because, for example, if we just pick this spider record, you'll see I ID'd it to family, and then someone else has indeed come along and added a species ID. But it's just a good basic way of seeing all of your records where someone else hasn't added an ID yet. There is a way to get records where no one else has added an ID at all to your record, but that requires a much more complex request via the API, which is a little bit above my pay grade for that particular kind of request. But there are some, if you are interested in finding out how to do that, message me afterwards and I can give you the names of a couple of experts who'll be able to do that for you. And in terms of, do people look at older records? Yeah, absolutely, all the time, myself included. More often than not. So every now and then when I'm feeling a bit bored, I'll pick a particular genus or a family and I'll go through all the old records and clean them up. And what I'll actually do when I'm identifying those is I'll order them in reverse chronological order. So I'll actually address all the oldest records first before the newer ones, just because I know that those older records do tend to have slipped between the cracks, as it were. So what I do is I'll go to the Identify tab, and then let's say I'm interested in IDing the genus Scaevola, and let's say I'm interested in looking at it in New South Wales. And so then I would go to filters, and what I would do is I would sort by date added, and then instead of descending, I can pick ascending. And so now this first one here will be the oldest record. And so you can see this one was submitted 6 years ago. Alternatively, you don't even have to change that filter. So if I change it, so if I just change that back to descending, let me refresh the page. Let me just reset that. So if I just do that basic set of searches again, I don't even have to, in fact, actually change that filter at all. All I have to do is scroll down and I can just go to the numbers and I can just pick what the last page is. And then I usually just start to work my way backwards. And so you can see here again, here's that same one that was uploaded 6 years ago. So yeah, it's probably not as common as people looking at the most recent, but there are definitely people out there, myself included, who are looking at the old records. And it's often just a matter of time. You know, I tend to be a very impatient person and I get a bit antsy if people aren't identifying my records straight away. But I do recognize that sometimes you just got to be patient. And there are things I uploaded 4 or 5 years ago that have been identified for me in the last week or the last month. So I always just maintain that hope that someone eventually will stumble upon the record who recognizes it and can ID it for you. And it's always a pleasant surprise when one of those things do happen. Rosalie just said she just agreed to one of my IDs. So thank you for that. So that kind of largely covers the kind of questions and points that people had sent through beforehand. So now, so I see I've got about 15 minutes left officially, but I might go about 10 minutes over if that's okay. So if everyone here is okay with that, feel free to leave at 3 o'clock if you have to, but I will go about 10 minutes over time to cover the rest of the things that I do want to cover. I'll quickly just address a couple of questions that have just been popped in the chat. So Susan just said, I have a question about the mating behavior observed field for fish. If I've observed mating behavior in fish, you don't see the abdominal segments touching as is stipulated in the text, so I didn't put it in. But that makes it difficult to tell what time of year is normal for this behavior. See the screenshot. So in this case, if there is an existing, so just to quickly demonstrate to people what Susan means here, in addition to those annotations, there are also things called observation fields, which are effectively like annotations, but they're far more flexible, and there are thousands and thousands of them. So you can see here on the right-hand side, annotations, you only have a select few. So for plants, I can only choose from phenology or sex. And then when I click the drop-down, I've only got limited options. But if I go down to observation fields, there are thousands upon thousands. So they're completely flexible. So count, for example, there's about 1 million different count ones. So this is where maybe you saw a flock of birds and you wanted to report exactly how many individuals were in the flock. You could click count, and then you can see here that the text tells you to say how many individuals you observed. These fields, as I said, are very, very flexible. All of them are created by individual users, so they are not proscribed by iNaturalist. So in this case, Susan, what I would recommend is if that field, you felt like it didn't fit your particular use case, I would just create a new field yourself, and then and you can start adding that. So to create a field, let me try and remember. Let me pick one where I already have fields. So let me bear with me for 1 second. So let's click this. Go to one that already has a field. And I will provide you with this link in 1 second. Observation fields, and then new. Okay, so here is the link if you ever want to create a new observation field yourself. So I've just posted that in the chat. That is the link to use if you want to ever create a new observation field yourself. I highly, highly, highly recommend first searching for an observation field before you make one to make sure you're not duplicating. Make sure, so the link to just all observation fields where you can search for them, I've just posted that. It's literally the exact same link, just without the slash and new at the end. So this is where you can search. So if I search for fish breeding, it's going to require exact. So if I search for the word fish example, this now brings up all the different fields that include the word fish. Or if I search for the word breeding, here are all the different fields that include the word breeding and what they require you to do. So if one of those still doesn't satisfy your needs, that is when you can create a new observation field yourself and then apply it to your own observations. Martin said, when loading large amounts of images into iNat PC browser where GPS has failed to attach to images, can I select and update the location on more than one image at a time? Yes, absolutely you can. So I can show you how to do this. So let's say you're in the upload screen, you're wanting to upload your photographs. Let's go to my photos. Let's just say I pick these totally random photos. So let's just say I have uploaded these 4 plants. You can see for all of them, the location is missing, and the location should be the same for all of them. All I have to do is click this select all box at the top. You can see all of them are now outlined in green. And instead of clicking in these boxes, I click on the location box on the left-hand side where you see it says editing for observations. Click in the location box, go and find my location, click there, click blue update, and you'll see the location has now been applied to all 4 of them. Now, let's say that you only wanted to apply that location to 3 of them. Instead of clicking select all, what you would do is you would click the first one, Then you would hold down the control key on your keyboard, and then you would click the other ones that you also wanted to apply this to. You can see they're now outlined in green. And then you do the exact same thing. You see editing 3 observations on the side. You just click in the box, and then you can click your location, and it will update that location you can see just for those 3. You can also do this for any of the other fields. So you can apply the date to all of your records at the same time, the species name, the notes. You can do it for all of them at the same time. No problems. And then Libby also asked, do you know of any phenology research which is using iNat and whose methodologies we could use in our local area, or any scientists who are researching some aspect of phenology using iNat? Yeah, there's 1,000,001. So there's heaps and heaps of phenology studies that are currently, and if I just very briefly go to Google Scholar, and if we search for papers that include iNaturalist and phenology, you can see there are actually heaps. So there are lots and lots of papers and studies that are coming out all across the world that are looking at phenology and iNaturalist data. So perhaps one of the most valuable ones might be this methodological paper where they actually talk about methods, which might be the most useful for you, Libby. So I'm going to post the link to that particular one in the chat as well. But pretty much if you just go to Google Scholar and search for phenology and iNaturalist, there is a huge amount of research out there that is being published, and that's increasing every day. Okay, so to bump back to some of my specific little tips and tricks I was going to talk about. So this is very much quite an eclectic range of tips and pieces of advice I have here. So I will kind of jump around from example to example. So one cool thing that hopefully not a lot of you knew that you could do is that you can actually paste a photo into a comment on iNaturalist. So this is something that I find that not a lot of people know you can actually do. So let's say I'm just going to go to Nick as an example because I can harass him on one of his observations. So just as penance, I'll ID that for him. And now you'll see that if I want to leave a comment, I can write a textual comment, right? And that works completely fine. But let's say I want to post a picture into this comment. So let's find a photo. And let's say I've got this photo and for whatever reason, I want to paste this photo into a comment. So I'll right click, I'll click copy image. And you'll see I'm trying to paste it and it's not working. Paste, it's not working. I can't paste the comment in. So, but there is an easy way to paste photographs directly into comments. So what this requires you to do is you need to store the image somewhere online. So you can do it without storing it, and I'll do that first, but then I'll explain why storing it is much more useful. If I want to paste this particular image into the comment, I'll right click on it. And then instead of clicking copy image, you instead need to click copy image address. So once I've clicked that, I go back here, and then I need to type in this text, and I'll explain this in a second. And you can see I've now pasted a photo or image into the comment. So the exact text that you need, and I will now paste this into the chat for you. So all you got to do is type in the less than sign, and then IMG, and then space, and then SRC, and then quotation marks, and then a greater than sign. And then within the quotation marks, you paste that image address that you just copied. And that will then allow you to paste a comment, a photo into any comment you would like. There's then also additional text you can add after that to change the size of the image, but I won't go into that now. But storage, right? So the reason it's important is that, so I've just copied this image from this random page online, but the problem happens is, let's say that this website decides to change the URL to that particular image, or that website goes down, that link will then become broken. And when I go back to my image that I've pasted in the comment, it will actually no longer appear there anymore. So to kind of circumvent this is you can actually store the image somewhere online where there'll always be a local copy of that image. The way I do this is I go to the discussion forum, and this is another useful way. Another reason I should say that the discussion forum is really useful. You can actually send messages to yourself on the forum. So what I do is I just send all of these photos to myself on the forum in a personal message. And so then anytime I ever want to copy one of these, all I have to do is go to that particular image, right-click, click copy image address, go back to it, type in my text, and I can paste that image directly in there. And it's a much stabler and safer way of doing it, because I won't say 100% guarantees, but it pretty much guarantees that this image will always stay there and that the link won't break. It's far more likely that it might break if you're just copying it from any random website. Whereas if you do it into here, it's the same thing applies for other image depositories. You don't just have to do it in the forum. If anyone has an Imgur account, so there's a image storage website called Imgur. You can do the same thing. So you can create an Imgur account, you can upload your images there, and you can do the same thing. So I will just delete all of those. So that's just a nice way. So the way that I use this is often say, sometimes I'm doing an identification for someone and I want to provide some comparative material saying, here's why I made that ID, here's a similar species, here's some ID tips that I might have made in a nice little image. It's just a really great way of easily attaching that image into a comment. Let's see. Okay. So one feature of iNaturalist that many of you would be familiar with is the computer vision suggestions, where you can pick the drop-down option and it will basically tell you what it thinks the image is. So in this case, you can see I can click in the suggest an identification bar, and it will come down with a drop-down of what the system thinks your photo is of. And it's getting increasingly better all the time. And you can see, in fact, in this particular case, this species is Vicia hirsuta, and that's the top option that it has suggested. But sometimes you'll encounter a situation like this, where you might have, say, a plant and an insect in the same photo. Now, if, let's say, I want the bee to be my example, and I'm focusing on the bee in this case, let's click in the suggest an identification option, and you can see, great, it picks the bee as the first option, and pretty much all the options are insects as well. So this is working as I wanted. But let's say I wanted to focus in this particular photo actually on the plant. So let's say I took this photograph, but then afterwards I'm thinking, oh, actually, I'm really interested in what plant this is, and I want to ID the plant instead. I don't really know where to start. So I'm saying, okay, let's see what the computer vision suggestions are, but they're all of bees. None of the suggestions are of plants because it's focusing on the bee. You can actually force the computer vision to suggest options for the plant instead. So the way to do this is to first make sure you have an ID of plant. So let's say I change the ID to plant. So now you can see the ID is plant. Now let's see what happens if I pick those computer vision options. You can see all the options are now plants. And in fact, the top option of Stomodia florulenta is the correct one. So you can actually force the computer vision to pick which subject in the photo it is trying to predict by first giving it a course ID. So if you find that you've got a picture of a bee in a flower and the computer vision is picking up the flower for whatever reason, first just add a course ID of insect or bee, then look at the computer vision options again, and you will actually force it to provide you with insect options and bee options. And the opposite works as well. If you put a course ID of plant, you can then force it to provide you with plant options. And so that's just a really cool trick where you can actually manipulate the computer vision suggestions. So we'll just restore that back to the bee. So another really cool thing I often find that you can do is, okay, so I'll briefly touch on some of the API tools. So this is a phrase I've mentioned about 5 or 10 minutes ago, and it's something I've mentioned briefly in some of my other workshops. But basically, there's this thing called the iNaturalist API, and it's effectively this way of retrieving all kinds of complex searches and requests for data. So I will just put this link into the chat for you. Okay, so there's the link to the API in case anyone does want to explore it. A lot of the time, the API functionality is way over my head, as I mentioned before, but there are some absolutely amazing users in the discussion forum that are absolute legends with it. And so what a lot of people have done is they have constructed these really amazing third-party tools that use the API to then build this tool that do all kinds of amazing things that you wouldn't normally be able to do in iNaturalist directly. And I'll just give you an example of two of these that I find to be pretty useful. So the first of these is, I will post again this into the chat for you. So this is a really cool tool where sometimes people will ask me, is it possible to find species that I have observed that no one else in the world has observed on iNaturalist? And the answer to that is yes. So all you got to do is plug in this particular link into your browser, and then where it says the beachcomber, just replace that with your particular username. It takes a little while to load. It then brings up this massive list for you. And what it's doing is, on the left-hand column, it's saying how many observations in the world there are for iNaturalist. And then on the right-hand column, it's saying how many of your observations there are for that particular species. So all of the species where it's 1 and 1, it means that I have the only observation in the entirety of iNaturalist for that species. And then when it becomes 2 versus 1, you can see, okay, well, there are actually 2 observations of this species on iNaturalist, mine and someone else's. And then as you start to scroll down, that number on the left will start to get bigger and bigger. And there ends up being a limit to it. But basically, it's going from smallest to biggest. So if I was to then click on one of these numbers, it will actually bring it up for you. All the observations, as you can see, for this particular species of snail, there are 2 observations, my one, and then someone else's one. Whereas if I click on one of the ones, you can see, okay, for this particular plant, there's only 1 observation in the entirety of iNaturalist, and it's mine. So it's just a really nice way of, if you're particularly interested in which of your observations, which of the species that you observed are particularly rare, at least in the context of iNaturalist, that's a nice, easy tool to do so. The other tool I'll show you here is this notifications tool, which I have now posted as well into the chat for you. So imagine this scenario, and this is a scenario I kind of go through semi-regularly. So often I'll go on field work where I might be away from home for about a week. I'm often in remote areas where I might not have internet at all. So in that time, I'll have a whole lot of notifications that start building up. And I might come back after my 1-week trip to 200 or 300 notifications in my notifications bubble here. Now, as a lot of you will probably have realized, if I click on that notifications bubble and then I click on one of the individual notifications and go to that observation, and then I go to re-click on that bubble, it actually clears all the notifications, and only the 10 most recent will actually appear in this drop-down menu. Now, to get around that, I used to just manually, so I would click on this, and then I would have to right-click on each of these, and I might then have to open up like 200 tabs so that I don't lose them all. There's actually a really handy way of getting all observations that you haven't opened yet, and that is with this particular tool here. So all you got to do is go to this particular link. You then click this big blue authorize button. You then just got to click the green authorize button again. And it will then take you to this setup where if you have unopened notifications, so notifications that you accidentally clicked off and you lost them, but you hadn't visited the observation yet, they will all be shown here on this screen for you. So it's this really, really awesome notification management tool that allows you to find effectively notifications that you lost, but you still wanted to be able to go back to them. Keeping in mind, though, once you have clicked on a notification, it will no longer, actually, no, you can. Yeah, so it actually will be able to show you. So this is actually even more fantastic. Actually, I completely forgot about this functionality. It will actually show you all the notifications that basically you have ever gotten. So if there's some notification that you previously had opened up and you want to revisit it, just set this viewed to be true. And it allows you to view pretty much every notification you've ever gotten. I assume there's probably some kind of time limit if you go back. Like, for example, I have gotten literally hundreds of thousands of notifications, maybe even more than 1 million over the past few years. So it's possible that there's actually a throttle that's been placed on this, but you should be able to get to it. And I'll just briefly answer this question. So the question was, sorry, I missed how to get the ALA map. That does not show the obscured stuff. So if you go to the ALA and you search just for, say, Sepia apama, the giant cuttlefish, and you go to that and you just go view and download records, and you go to the map, by default, this is excluding all that obscured stuff from iNaturalist. So the default map is with the excluded stuff left out. But if you do want to see the excluded stuff, you can either untick the box here. So it's the one where it says location uncertainty. If you untick that, it will add it to the same map. Or alternatively, if you only want to see those ones, you just click that hyperlinked text, and now it's only showing you the obscured stuff. Martin said, can we duplicate observations? I often record birds using audio on my phone. Can I duplicate the observation in the Android app or the PC, or do I need to find the original recording on my phone? No, absolutely, you can duplicate it very easily without having to go back. So you can either do that whilst you're uploading, or you can do it after the fact. So if you remember to duplicate it while you're uploading, you can do it like this. So let's just say I've added, let's go find a sound file that I have. So here's a sound file that I have of a lyrebird call that I was recording. And let's just say at the same time, you remembered that there was another bird calling in there as well. All you've got to do is click this duplicate button, and it will duplicate the observation for you. And if I have filled out, say, the date, it will automatically duplicate the date and the location and stuff for me as well. But let's say I've already uploaded an observation. It's really easy to duplicate it as well. So here is an observation that I've made. Let's say 5 months down the track, I realize, oh, there's actually another species in that photo that I want to duplicate the photo for, the observation for, and I can't remember where I have the original photo on my computer. All you got to do is go to this blue drop down, click the arrow, and you can click duplicate, and it will create a completely duplicated observation for you. It will fill out all the date, the location, everything. You've just got to refill out the species name. So really, yeah, really simple to duplicate for you. I will just deal with one last thing because I realize it is now 3:10 and some people will have to go. So I'll deal with one more really cool feature, which I find to be one of the most underrated features in iNaturalist for when you're trying to identify records. So let's say that I'm interested, and we'll use Scaveler again. So let's say I'm interested in helping out identify some Scaveler records for people. So what I'll do is I'll go up to the search, and I will look up Scaveler. And I can see automatically, and let's filter it to New South Wales as well. I am now looking at all Scaveler records, and then I can go ahead and start identifying some of these. And that's pretty straightforward, right? Or alternatively, let's say I'm even interested in this particular species, the hairy fanflower, and I want to go through and confirm records of this particular species. Now, again, pretty straightforward. I can click on one of these records. This one was uploaded 9 minutes ago. I can look at that. Yep, that's definitely this species. I can click agree. No worries whatsoever. But what happens if you have a record like this? Let's see where I put it. Okay, let's say what happens if you have a record like this, where the photograph is definitely of the hairy fanflower, but unfortunately, the first identification that a person put in was wrong. Subsequently, there have been 2 correct IDs, but we need a 3rd one to override it. So in this case, this record will not appear in my hairy fanflower search because it hasn't been identified the species yet, right? It will not appear in my genus search because you'll see that currently it's not identified to genus. It will not even appear if I even search for the entire family. It will not appear because you can see currently the common denominator between the original wrong ID and these two correct ones is all the way up at order. But there is a really fantastic way that you can actually find all of these records. So what I do, first of all, is I will search for the hairy fanflower in the basic search. Now, remembering that I said every single taxon in iNaturalist has a unique identifying code. So I go up to the URL and I see that the unique identifying code is 321199. So now, and the other thing you'll see here is that as a prelude to that code, it says taxon_ID. What I want to do is I'm just going to add in one string of text and an extra underscore, and then press enter. And you'll notice that the number of observations jumped up from 1,415 to 1,458. So what I did was I included this piece of text, and I will now put that in the chat for you. So all you have to do is put in that string of text, IDENT, so ident, short for identify, underscore taxon underscore ID equals, and then the code. And what it's now doing is it's searching for all observations that have at least one active identification of that particular species, no matter whether there are other wrong IDs as well. So what it's now doing is it is now retrieving this particular record as well, because there is currently at least one active identification of this species. And so now it retrieves it. And the way to explicitly search for those ones that are not currently at a species level, so the ones where there's some kind of disagreement, is to go to filters, and then where it says rank, pick low, and then adjust that to genus. So you'll see that this now filters it down to 39 observations where at least one person has added hairy fanflower as an ID, but there's currently some kind of disagreement. So if we pick this one as a random one, you can see the current consensus at the top is genus. And if we look down, you see someone has said Scaevola amula, two other people have said Scaevola ramosissima. So I can look at that. That's definitely hairy fanflower. I can click agree. Now we've outweighed that original wrong ID, and you can see the ID at the top has shifted to species. So I can then go through all of these ones, and this explicitly allows me to find all of those records that are effectively being masked from your traditional search of the species or of the genus. So I can click this one. So this one is actually Scaevola calendulacea. So you can see it's one that I've already added an ID to. So you can see there was an original incorrect ID of fairy fanflower. I came along, I added a corrective ID. There's now been another one. In this case, we need one more correcting ID of June fanflower. And so the easy way to find that is to do it via this search. It's where you just put ident underscore taxon underscore ID. And it's basically, as I said, retrieving every single observation where there is at least one ID of that species, no matter whether or not that is the correct ID or not. So it's just a really good way of finding a lot of these records that often slip between the cracks. So I could keep talking for hours here, but I think I will wrap things up there for now. So what I will do is I'll just open it back up if anyone has any last second questions that they want to ask. So yeah, definitely feel free to pop those in the chat, or if you wanted to unmute yourself now and just ask the question, yeah, definitely feel free. And yeah, fingers crossed that at least everyone here has learned at least one new tip and trick that they didn't know about before.
Thomas?
Yes.
It's Rose and Lawrence here.
How are you?
Fine, this might actually be a bit longer, but I asked you a question in the forums about journaling. So I want to learn how to do that. Is that a bit long to deal with here, or have a more separate conversation?
No, I can briefly do that.
Because what I found was frustrating was that they had, you could search by dates and by topics, but I'd like to be able to store the journaling by topics, and I couldn't see a way of doing that with
No,
the one
so
that you recommended to me with the fishes.
yeah, so also in that specific case, I might have a chat to you afterwards about that. That might take
Okay.
a bit longer to
But
explain.
perhaps you can talk a bit about journaling anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Robin?
So a really underrated feature I find that not a lot of people know exists is journals. So this is basically a way of, say you want to provide a message to people, or you created some kind of identification guide that you wanted to share, you can do so through a journal. So what you do is, once you go to your profile, you'll notice that there's this journal posts tab. So you can click on journal posts, and then you can click new post, and you can basically write up what is essentially the equivalent of a blog or an article. And so you'd give it, an informative title, and then you can start typing in the body. It basically works as HTML for anyone familiar with that. So there's a lot of HTML tricks you can do for things like making text bold or italics or inserting photos and things like that. And basically they're available on people's profiles. So if you go to my profile, you can see that it says I've written 14 journal posts. And so then you can go to these particular journal posts, and I just write them when I've done an ID guide, for example. So here's one as an example that I did a few weeks ago. I created a photographic guide to all the non-yellow flowering oxalis in Australia. So first I gave a bit of an introduction. And then what I did was I made all these photographic plates on my computer using photographs from iNaturalist. And then I have a full identification guide to all of these species in Australia. And so you can see I just have all these photographic plates that I made. So I did this over the course of a couple of days. And this is now effectively an identification resource that is available for anyone. And so then what I did was I tagged a whole lot of people that I thought might be interested. And so this is another great thing about journal posts, is there's a comments section at the bottom. So this then allowed a big discussion with lots of other users commenting. Really useful was this guy, Kenneth Oberlander. He's an oxalis expert from South Africa. And he provided a whole lot of extra tips and notes for me that I was then able to go back and edit the journal post and incorporate those as well. So they're just and on top of that, you can also write journal posts within projects. So if we go to Atlas of Life in the Coastal Wilderness, if you are a project owner, you can actually create journal posts. You can write journal posts in there as well. So you can see here, there are journal posts written within this project. And so it's just a really good way of advertising events like this, for example, or things that are going on. There might be community events, that whether they're online or in person. So just journal posts are generally a really good way of communicating, either with people that might follow you in general as an individual, or communicating with participants or members of your project, or just if you want to create some kind of resource in general that anyone can access at any time. Journals are a really great way of doing that.
Right then, Thomas, shall we wrap up now?
Yeah, no, that sounds good to me. And sorry, I'll just end by saying, if anyone ever has any questions, difficulties, anything they want to find out about iNaturalist at all, please feel free to either message me directly or email me at any time, and I'm always happy to help.
Yes, on behalf of us all, Thomas, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. It's been inspirational, and you've covered such a breadth of topics in such an efficient manner. It's been an absolute delight, and thank you for your time. It's greatly appreciated.
No worries at all. Always my pleasure.
Okay, so we'll draw this this session to a close. Thank you all for attending. I hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have. And thank you once again to Thomas. Right. Thank you. Bye for now. Hope to see you in the traps, around the traps.